Thank you. I just want to start by saying a few things about the Justice Without Retribution Network before I get into my talk. So the Justice Without Retribution Network is a collaborative venture trying to bring together philosophers, lawyers, psychologists, neuroscientists, people from criminal justice to look at non-retributive approaches to criminal punishment that are ethically defensible and practically workable. And there are 4 co-directors of the network. It's Farah Foucault, Dirk Piraboom, myself, and Elizabeth Shaw. And the 4 institutions that are the contributing institutions are Cornell University, Ghent University, the University of Aberdeen School of Law, and SUNY Corning. And so this is our 3rd conference. The first conference was at the University of Aberdeen 3 years ago. Our 2nd conference was last year at Cornell University, and this is our 3rd installment. We probably will have a sign-in sheet at some point in the back, and if you're interested to find out more about the Institute, you could put your name and email address, and we'll keep you on an email list for the network. And we also hope to produce some of the papers that are going to be presented in the next 2 days in a special issue of Neuroethics, so keep your eye out for that, perhaps. Is that good? Yeah. All right, so I'm going to jump right in, and my talk today is on freewill skepticism and the public health quarantine model, which is a model that I've been working on and developed, and it builds off of work that Dirk Piraboom has done. So my plan of action is the following. I don't know if I'll be able to get through all of this. We'll see. But I want to briefly summarize my arguments and my reasons for adopting freewill skepticism. I'll explain what freewill skepticism is in a minute as well. But this is not going to be the focus of my talk. This is just some introductory comments to give you a sense of what my position is, where I'm starting from, and why I adopt the view. Then I'm going to explain why freewill skepticism is inconsistent with what's called retributive or retributive punishment, which is one of the main forms of justification for criminal punishment in the criminal justice system. Many in the room are probably aware of what retributivism is, and you might also be aware of why it would be inconsistent with this view on free will. But I want to set it up so that we could understand that the challenge for someone like myself is to explain what I would replace it with, what the alternative would be. Then I'm going to introduce some additional reasons that you might want to reject retributivism or retributive punishment independent of my views on free will. So even if you're not a free will skeptic, there might be additional reasons you might want to reject this conception of punishment and this approach to criminal justice. Then I'll quickly outline my alternative, my non-retributive alternative, which I call the public health quarantine model, and I'll kind of very quickly lay that out and explain the basics of that account. If I have time, which I might not, I want to reply to some objections, but I'll just state that there have been a number of recent responses that Dirk Piraboom has made and I've made to a number of criticisms that have come out against our theory. So we've addressed a lot of these objections in publications, forthcoming and already published publications. But maybe I'll just deal with it in the Q&A. If there are objections in the room, we could address those. Okay, so just to begin, and this is for maybe the non-philosophers in the room, the original view, so freewill skepticism maintains that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And because of this, we're never morally responsible in a very specific sense. It's called the basic desert sense. And this is a sense of punishment, of moral responsibility that would be backward-looking and non-consequential. And I'll explain more about what all that amounts to in a moment. But in the past, the main reason for adopting this kind of view of free will skepticism or denial of free will was called hard determinism. And that was the view that determinism is true and inconsistent with free will. And this is either because determinism was incompatible with the ability to do otherwise, which was called leeway incompatibilism, or that determinism was incompatible with one's being the ultimate source of their actions, which was called source incompatibilism. There are very few hard determinists around nowadays. Most free will skeptics are not classical hard determinists because the hard determinist was committed to the thesis that determinism was true and universally true, that everything that occurs is the inevitable result of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. Quantum mechanics has thrown into doubt perhaps the universal nature of determinism. So most contemporary free will skeptics are what are called hard incompatibilists. This is Dirk Pereboom's term. And it maintains that while determinism is incompatible with free will, so too is indeterminism. And so ultimately, there's no free will either way. So whatever the fundamental nature of reality is, whether it's deterministic or indeterministic, both conceptions are inconsistent with the kind of control that would be needed to ground free will and basic desert moral responsibility. So these are my official reasons for being a hard incompatibilist. So just bear with me. This is very philosophical for those who are not philosophers. But against the view that free will is compatible with the causal determination of our actions by natural factors beyond our control, i.e. against a view called compatibilism that maintains determinism is true and compatible with free will, I argue, following Dirk Pereboom here, that there's no relevant difference between that prospect and our actions being causally determined by manipulators. So Dirk has this four-case argument, for example, where he lays out cases where agents are manipulated by a team of neuroscientists or manipulated in different ways. Our intuitions that agents are not free or morally responsible in those cases. And then you segue between the four cases to a case of natural determinism. And the argument is that there's no relevant philosophical or metaphysical distinction between the various cases. And so if your intuition is that agents are not free and responsible in the first, they shouldn't be free and responsible in the last case. I diverge a little bit with Dirk because I also believe that this determinism is incompatible with an agent's ability to do otherwise, which I think is a necessary condition for free will. So I'm not completely sold, for those who know of the Frankfurt cases, that those successfully refute the principle of alternative possibilities. There's another account called event causal libertarianism. Libertarians believe in free will, believe in indeterminist account of free will. They maintain that if determinism is true, there's no free will, but they maintain indeterminism is the case. Event causal indeterminists maintain that there's indeterminism, but only at the level of events. They don't bring in any spooky, non-naturalistic sui generis kinds of causation, for example. The argument there is that such accounts are unable, that on such accounts, agents are unable to settle whether a decision occurs or what outcome results, and hence don't have the control required for moral responsibility. So I make this argument in my 2012 book, and Dirk Pereboom has pushed these arguments against event causal indeterminism as well. For the non-philosophers, maybe I'll just gloss over this and not go into detail because it's not the focus of my talk. There is a kind of account called agent causal libertarianism, and I do think that could supply the kind of control that would be needed to save free will and moral responsibility, but I argue that such accounts can't be reconciled with our best philosophical and physical theories about the world, because they bring in very mysterious kinds of metaphysical commitments, sui generis kinds of causation, agents that are more than just the physical nature of the constituent parts. They're not consistent with the kind of naturalism or the modern sort of scientific worldview that I think is well supported. But I've also argued in my 2012 book they face additional problems with preserving mental causation, that your beliefs and desires and intentions cause your actions. I think that's a necessary condition for free will, but given their metaphysical commitments, they have a hard time accounting and preserving that kind of mental causation. So I think they founder against both our best scientific and our best philosophical accounts about the world. So since this exhausts the sort of various options one could have on free will, I think the default position should be what's called freewill skepticism, that we should remain skeptical that we have the kind of free will and basic desert that is needed to preserve retributive punishment and other kinds of beliefs in free will. I just mentioned very quickly that there are other reasons to reject free will that I'm not going to go into. One is a kind of luck concern. I'm actually largely convinced of these kind of issues as well. My official reason for being a skeptic are the ones I just laid out. But Neil Levy has an excellent book called Hard Luck. It's a great title for a book. But Why Luck Undermines Free Will and Moral Responsibility. And the basic argument there is something called constitutive luck, the kind of luck that makes you have the character and the individual nature that you have. The byproduct of who we are is often an outgrowth of factors beyond our control, factors of luck, the lottery of life, conditions we're born into, environmental circumstances. But then there are also what he calls cases of present luck, luck at the moment of choice. So this is a matter of what ideas come to you in a particular moment, what reasons become salient in the moment that you act, what the luck of what choices you're confronted with, what options are available to you at that particular moment, and also issues of luck having to do with situational factors that you might have an influence on the behavior and your outcomes that you're not aware of. So the combination of constitutive luck and present luck ultimately swallow all. So regardless of whether the world is deterministic or indeterministic, you might reject free will simply because of concerns over luck. And then there's a famous kind of view held by Nietzsche, most famously, and then more recently by Galen Strawson, that these concepts themselves, free will and ultimate responsibility, are just inherently incoherent. And that's because they require agents are causes of themselves, causa sui, which is impossible. So it's just conceptually troubling, the whole concept of free will and basic desert. But here's what they all have in common. So all of these arguments for free will skepticism have in common the view that, and the belief that what we do and the way we are is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, whether those be determinism, indeterminism, or luck. And because of this, we're never morally responsible for our actions in what's called the basic desert sense. That's the sense that would make you truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward in a non-consequentialist, backward-looking sense. So for example, if I say, why blame you or why punish you, one answer you may give is that you deserve it. That's backward-looking. It presupposes the agent was free and morally responsible and needs to be given their just deserts. If you say, why punish an individual, and you say because it'll make us safer, or it will deter crime, or will morally educate the agent, that tends to be what's called forward-looking reasons. Those are perfectly consistent with free will, forward-looking justifications. But backward-looking, non-consequentialist justifications based on the notion that individuals have basic desert, moral responsibility, are rejected by free will skeptics. So it's the claim that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, and because of this, it would be inherently unjust to punish and blame, reward and praise individuals in this backward-looking sense. Does that make sense to most of you? Okay, good. So that's the thesis. I've also just very quickly mentioned there are also internal threats to free will that I won't go into here, but I develop in my book based on recent developments in the behavioral, cognitive, and neurosciences. The two main areas of threat right now come from neuroscience and social psychology. Dirk Peereboom and I have a recent paper coming out, forthcoming, where we argue that the neuroscientific arguments for free will skepticism are actually unconvincing and don't establish global skepticism. That's a slight change from my earlier views in my 2012 book. But I do still think that there are legitimate threats from the literature in psychology and social psychology on automaticity, situationism, the adaptive unconscious. I will say, and I'll be forthright about this, I don't think these types of arguments will ever establish global skepticism, refute free will. But they might actually shrink the realm of morally responsible agents. Thomas Nettelhofer calls this the threat of shrinking agency. And so when I take off my free will skepticism hat sometimes to play along with compatibilists, I play internal to their own commitments and say they suffer from certain empirical constraints that might shrink the realm even for a compatibilist. But that's when I'm being friendly and I'm not a global skeptic. Then I put my global skepticism hat back on and I say, I don't even want to play the games that the compatibilists are playing. Okay, so the important thing to note, especially for the context of this conference, is that this view I have on free will skepticism, is incompatible with what we call retributive punishment, retributivism. So let me say a few words about retributivism. because this is also the justice without retribution network, right? So within the criminal justice system, incarceration is often seen as justified by the desert of people who have committed crimes. Because they're guilty, not just legally guilty, but morally, we can impose significant sanctions on them, some of them very extreme. So retributive justification for punishment maintains that the punishment of a wrongdoer is justified for the reasons that he or she deserves something bad to happen to them just because they have knowingly done wrong. And that can include everything from pain, deprivation, all the way up to the death penalty, right? Here's the thing to note, it's purely backwards looking in its justification. It's not reducible to forward-looking or consequentialist reasons. It doesn't appeal to the safety of society, the moral improvement of agents, retributivism, deterrence. So it requires a conception of free will and basic desert. It maintains agents justly deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done, and it's purely backwards looking. I have to reject this conception because of my commitments that I just laid out on free will. I don't believe agents ever justly deserve to be punished or suffer for actions that are ultimately the result of factors beyond their control. Okay. Let me help spell this out a little bit more, though, and just use some examples, past and present. So most of you are familiar with Immanuel Kant. He was famously a retributivist, and he gives a very famous passage, it's been cited numerous times, where he says, imagine an island society that's going to disband. They're going to scatter among the world. They're all going to dissolve themselves as a society and leave the island. But there's one remaining prisoner in prison for murder on the island. So I'll take up the quote halfway through. He says that the last murderer lying in prison ought to be executed before the resolution was carried out. This ought to be done in order that everyone may realize the desert of his deeds and that blood guiltiness may not remain upon the people. For otherwise, they might be regarded as participating in the murder as a public violation of justice. So you have to execute this last prisoner before you leave the island, because you have to give this person their just deserts. Not because they're going to be a threat to anyone else on the island. There's not going to be anyone left. It's not for the moral improvement of the agent. You're going to kill him. It's not to send a signal to anyone else about crime, because there's going to be no one left to send a signal to. It's simply because that individual has to be given their just deserts. And Kant actually argues that you wouldn't be respecting the agent if you didn't give them their just deserts. You get the impression of a parent spanking the child and saying, I'm not getting any pleasure from this, I'm doing it for your own good, right? And this is the concept of retribution that appeals to just deserts, and he directly references the notion of desert. A modern retributivist, probably the most famous legal scholar who defends retributivism today, is a legal scholar named Michael Moore. And he actually holds an account that's pretty extreme. It's very close to Kant. Not only would you be justified in punishing people based on the grounds of retributivism, you're morally obligated. And so he says on his version of retributivism, it's the view that we ought to punish offenders because and only because they deserve to be punished. Punishment is justified for a retributivist solely by the fact that those who receive it deserve it. And there's a more mild-mannered version of retributivism, and Mitchell Berman is a good example. So on Mitchell Berman's account, you would be justified in executing retributive punishment, but you wouldn't be obligated. There can be overriding reasons, for example, not to execute the person or to be opposed to the death penalty, things like that. But he says, quote, a person who unjustifiably and inexcusably causes or risks harm to others or to significant social interest deserves to suffer for that choice, and he deserves to suffer in proportion to the extent to which his regard or concern for others falls short of what is properly demanded of him. So all three of those quotes get at the heart of just deserts. I'm rejecting just deserts, so I'm rejecting retributive punishment, right? I'll just mention very quickly, my references tend to be to the US criminal justice system because that's my focus. But I want to note, I'm not going to read all the citations, but this is a justification for punishment that's deeply entrenched in the criminal law in the United States. So a number of sentencing guidelines in the US have adopted desert as their distributive principle. You could look at some of the references at the bottom. And it's increasingly given deference in the purposes section of state criminal codes. where it can be the guiding principle in the interpretation and the application of the code's provisions. I just wrote a piece for the Psychology Today that talks about the Model Penal Code, which is one of the great legal achievements in the United States, but it was just revised a couple weeks ago, actually only maybe a week ago. And it was originally written in 1962, but the recent revision of last month actually sets desert as the official dominant principle for sentencing. And the Supreme Court cites retributivism as the, quote, primary justification for the death penalty. So deeply entrenched. So the consequence of all these views is that if free will and moral responsibility skeptics are right, agents never deserve the imposition of retributive punishment. Backwards-looking punishment is off the table. But it also entails, and importantly entails, that elements of the criminal justice system are unjustified. Okay, I'm going to take a slight detour before I give you my model and say that there might be additional reasons, even if you don't agree with my views on free will, for rejecting retributivism. So the first reason, and I'll go through these in more detail, the first reason is that retributivism often leads to practices and policies that are excessively punitive and are counterproductive. Punitive meaning the desire to punish. And so I've written a lot about this. I won't go into too much detail, and there's actually a lot of empirical literature that's being done in psychology, social psychology, and experimental philosophy that shows where people's beliefs in free will are higher, we see increased punitiveness, increased desire to punish. And actually some studies have shown by diminishing the belief in free will, it's reduced the punitiveness and retributive attitudes. But instead of giving you the sort of psychological, empirical stuff, I'm going to give you some historical examples of that in a second. I'm not going to say much about number two, but I'll just quickly say something about it now. Even if retributive attitudes you think are practically work well on the interpersonal level, some compatibilists who don't agree with my skepticism now acknowledge that they don't really translate well to the institutional level, the level of institutional punishment. And that's what I'm talking about, institutional punishment, third-party punishment, punishment, justice exercised by the state. And so at our last Justice Without Retribution conference in Cornell, Manuel Vargas gave this argument, and he's a well-known compatibilist, and he maintains that on his account, the agency cultivation model says that retributive attitudes are needed to cultivate agents, build good moral beings. And he actually says there's an evolutionary adaptive function that evolved with these reactive attitudes and retributive attitudes that serve a function, evolutionarily speaking, throughout time. And then he says, however, they don't translate well to the institutional level. And because in the level of institutional punishment, these retributive attitudes that evolved through evolution on interpersonal grounds lose their kind of checks and balances. They lose some of the restrictions and some of the interpersonal constraints that you have on the personal level. And when they're institutionalized, they often lead to excessively punitive and counterproductive types of policies. As a free will skeptic, Dirk and I and Bruce and I and others would disagree even on the interpersonal level of the value, but I'll take what I can get. And at this point, I'm actually interested more in policy. And so I take the concession that retributivism fails on the institutional level, even for the compatibilists. Now, not all compatibilists say that, but many are going in this direction. And then lastly, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on this, I want to present an epistemic argument against retributivism. So here it goes. I'm starting, before I do that, I'll say that the desire for retribution and the strike back emotion often lead to policies and practices that are excessively punitive and counterproductive. So if you know about this, in the past, retributivism provided the philosophical justification for something called civil death. So civil death was a medieval European policy that said when you were found guilty of a certain type of crime and they declared you civilly dead, not only did you lose certain rights, like maybe your liberty, you lose all of your rights. You lose your property rights, your inheritance rights, the rights of constitutional protection. In fact, when you were declared civilly dead, you could be harmed, in some cases even killed, without any consequence to the person that harms you, because when you're declared civilly dead, you were viewed as living outside of society. And so you were open game for anyone to do whatever they wanted to you. Most of the policies of civil death have fallen by the wayside, but one remains entrenched in the US, and this is voter disenfranchisement. So in the run-up to the last election in the US, I wrote an article in Psychology Today that said that we should address voting rights for felons and ex-felons. So in the last election, 6.1 million Americans were barred from participating in the elections due to felony convictions. 3.1 million of those had already served their sentence, were no longer on parole or probation. And that's because there's at least six states in the United States that permanently bar you from ever voting again or participating. So not only after you've fulfilled your sentence, or while you're serving your sentence, you're barred from voting. Once you're finished, you're never allowed to be a full citizen again. It's even worse among certain populations. So in the African American community, they've been hit particularly hard. 1 in every 13 Black Americans have permanently lost their voting rights. Just think about that. I don't think that's unintentional either, by the way. This is an inherently retributive hangover of civil death. It says that you've done this moral wrong, you deserve to suffer, and you not only deserve to suffer by serving sentences or losing your liberty, but even after you've fulfilled your sentence. It's like a scarlet letter. You can never be fully integrated back into society. And this is counterproductive, by the way, in terms of reducing recidivism in crime. Another one, and I'll just quickly go through these. Obviously, most of you are aware of the mass incarceration problem, but in the United States, it's particularly bad. So the United States makes up about 5% of the world's population. Think about that, that's relatively small. Yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. That is the largest rate of incarceration known to civilization. There's been no other civilization throughout mankind that has ever incarcerated this many people. The United States incarcerates 700 people for every 100,000 people. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, certain Scandinavian countries hover around 60 to 70 per 100,000. So we literally incarcerate at 10 times the rate of, say, Norway. France incarcerates about 100 for every 100,000, so we incarcerate at 7 times the rate. And this is obviously not working because the United States has one of the highest rates of recidivism. 76.6% of prisoners will be rearrested within the first 5 years of release. 76%. And that's because what's the focus of the criminal justice system in the United States? It's to house people in relatively inhumane conditions, treat them like animals, cage them, not provide them with mental health services, educational opportunities, focus on rehabilitation, drug treatment. It's basically to let them stew in their own guilt, let them serve their own sentence. It's a kind of retributive focus, and then you release them and expect them to be model citizens. Well, it doesn't work that way. One of the reasons why Norway has one of the lowest rates of incarceration, also one of the lowest rates of crime, and also, I think, the lowest rate of recidivism in the developed world, it hovers around 16 to 20%, where we're nearly at 80%, is that the focus of the Norwegian system is rehabilitation and reintegration. And so these policies are counterproductive, they're not effective, and I think they're inherently inhumane. And so even if you don't have my views on free will, you might think this is just not working. Lastly, the retributive impulse leads to other kinds of policies, I think. I'll just name a few. In 2014, changes in the incentives and earning privileges scheme in England and Wales resulted in an effectively blanket ban on sending books to prisoners. Ban the books in prison movement. Luckily, it was struck down by the High Court because the High Court reasoned that, well, books are pretty important for rehabilitation. Depriving prisoners books is kind of counterproductive. But the desire to effectively ban books in prison was they don't deserve any luxuries. They don't deserve any advantages. They deserve to suffer, right? That's a purely backwards-looking retributive impulse. But when you look at it forward-looking sense, it doesn't reduce crime. It doesn't effectively rehabilitate people. It doesn't make them better coming out. And so it's just completely counterproductive. Most of you are aware of the Trump administration and the horrific effects of that. Even outside the United States, everyone is. But he assigned and chose Jeff Sessions for his attorney general. And he's a very retrograde kind of person who wants to go back to the war on drugs, the tough on crime, mandatory minimum sentences, and old retributive policies. So he just put out a memo to U.S. prosecutors and lawyers saying that they should seek tougher penalty for drug crimes. And he, and this is straight from the memo, said that they should charge and pursue the most serious and readily provable offenses. So as maximum sentences you can get, we should be pursuing maximum sentences. Further policies that are born of retributivism that are counterproductive include additional disenfranchisement of ex-felons. So I mentioned voter disenfranchisement, but that's not the only one. When prisoners are released, they often are barred from public housing in the United States because of their status as ex-felons. They have to declare on every job application that they're an ex-felon, which often prevents them from employment, from the ability to get themselves out of the situation and reintegrate. They set up all kinds of hurdles preventing ex-felons from reintegrating into society, and many of them have to resort back to crime just to make ends meet. These are just counterproductive from a forward-looking perspective. And withdrawing funding and money for prison education, work training, and rehabilitation programs. And this took place during the 1990s. It actually, under a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, was one of the worst periods for this. And we actually have evidence, empirical evidence, that when they took away Pell Grants and other educational funding for prisoners, recidivism rates went way up. And so when certain states, like New York State, re-implemented these educational programs, recidivism went down. So if you want factually based, empirically informed policy, look at the empirical data. All right. Very quickly, I want to mention the epistemic argument. So this starts with a kind of argument that Dirk Pierboom has been pushing, but Michael Corrado has pushed it, I've developed it, and it goes back to a very classic paper by Patrick Double on the hard-heartedness of libertarianism. But the argument runs something like this. Forget about my freewill skepticism. Punishment inflicts harm on individuals. Taking away their liberty, imprisoning them, putting them in cages does harm. The justification for such harm has to meet a high epistemic standard. If you're going to do harm to an individual, you have to have good epistemic warrant. You have to have good justification for doing that harm. Premise 2, if it is significantly probable that one's justification for harming another is unsound, then prima facie that behavior is seriously wrong. And yet the justification for retributive punishment or harm done on retributive grounds provided by both libertarians and compatibilists, the two accounts that would have to justify it, face powerful and unresolved objections, and as a result fall far short of the high epistemic bar that needs to be satisfied. So if you're going to do harm, you have to have good justification for doing harm. Retributivists rely on certain kind of vague metaphysical commitments to free will, basic desert, that lacks the kind of justification needed to reach that. And so freewill skepticism, actually, the notion skepticism, think of knowledge skepticism. You could be a skeptic in saying knowledge is impossible, or you could be a skeptic in saying we don't know if the standards for knowledge have been met, right? So we can't claim to have knowledge. So the epistemic argument here is saying you don't have the justification for thinking the conditions are in place, the justification has been satisfied. So the default should be you cannot do harm based on that justification. So let me run through these. I'm going to borrow a little work here by Bruce Waller, sorry. And he has a great book that came out last year on the stubborn system of moral responsibility, where he argues that the belief in moral responsibility, or basic desert moral responsibility, the belief tends to be stronger than the philosophical arguments for it, right? So the philosophical arguments presented in favor of basic desert, again, which are needed to justify the retributive harm, either suffer from scientific implausibility, like agent causation. We'll bring in mysterious kinds of agents that have powers that only gods can have, being uncaused causes and things like that. Or they're question begging. In the case of, say, Gallen-Strawson and others, I'll go through these, or they end up changing the subject, as say in the case of Daniel Dennett. So I have a paper forthcoming with Stephen Morris where we argue that Dan Dennett is not really answering the core question, he's changing the subject, because Dan Dennett, actually when you look at what he says, and he says it very forthrightly, doesn't believe in retributivism, and actually is a consequentialist about punishment. He uses just desserts language, which we think is completely misleading and out of place given his view. In fact, his views are basically synonymous with free will skeptics with regard to punishment. All right, so let me run through this real quick. Consider someone like Peter Van Inwagen, who doggedly, resolutely, and one may say stubbornly believes in moral responsibility. So after championing the consequence argument in favor of incompatibilism, this is one of the classic arguments against compatibilism. It says essentially that our actions are the result of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But since agents have no control over the laws of nature and they have no say over the events of the remote past, they ultimately have no say over their current actions, which are the result of those two factors. After presenting the consequence argument, Van Inwagen proceeds to argue that we must, though, reject determinism, even though it means free will remains a mystery. And he actually has a paper entitled Free Will Remains a Mystery. And he acknowledges we have no idea how we could have this kind of libertarian free will inconsistent with determinism. But we must have it because the consequence argument proves that if determinism is true, we can't have free will. Since, quote, he says, to deny the free will thesis is to deny the existence of moral responsibility, which is, wow, just absurd, right? So his belief in free will is much stronger than he has reason for believing we have it. In fact, he acknowledges we have no way of understanding how we could have it. It remains an absolute mystery, but we must have it. That doesn't reach the epistemic bar for me. But then it gets worse. He proceeds to argue that if science one day were able to somehow prove that determinism is true, then and only then, I think we should become compatibilists. That's right, you get it. After several decades of heroically defending the consequence argument, he's willing to simply chuck it out the window if determinism were proven true, simply to preserve moral responsibility. Because the belief in moral responsibility is much stronger than any of the arguments he has. He's willing to sacrifice his own, what he believes is a coherent, convincing argument. He's willing to adopt a mysterious kind of free will, even though he has no clue how we could have it. It gets even worse, clearly, for agent causal libertarians. So think of Campbell, Richard Taylor, Roderick Chisholm. They were willing to embrace mysterious and godlike powers and abilities to preserve moral responsibility. So most of you are familiar with the classic passage from Chisholm. So this is the classic defense he has of agent causal libertarianism. He says, if we are responsible, and if what I'm trying to say is true, then we have a prerogative which some would attribute only to God. Each of us, when we really act freely, is a prime unmoved mover, an uncaused cause. You have godlike abilities that you would only attribute to God. Richard Taylor is actually more forthright about it. Richard Taylor puts forth his theory saying, you have to adopt two rather strange metaphysical notions that you would never accept elsewhere in nature. That's a direct quote. And he later says, I can't put forth this theory wholly without embarrassment and without reservation. And he says, I wouldn't blame you if you just rejected it outright, rather than to accept the metaphysical commitments to which it points. I think Bruce Waller does a great job here in pointing out, and I love this quote, when contemporary philosophers are willing to posit miracles in order to save moral responsibility, the philosophical belief in moral responsibility obviously runs deep and strong. Now, naturalistically inclined event causal libertarians have it a little better because they don't bring in these mysterious godlike powers. They don't appeal to these questionable metaphysical agents or any of that. But when it comes to providing the epistemic justification needed for grounding retributive punishment, I think they too fall far short. So the most famous account here is Robert Kane. There are others by Mark Ballagher, and Laura Ekstrom and others. But Robert Kane's is the most famous. He says that the felt indeterminacy you have actually corresponds to real metaphysical indeterminacy in the brain, and it percolates up to the level of neural networks. And then ultimately, let's say you have a torn choice. He uses the example of a businesswoman who's deciding whether to go to her 9 o'clock meeting or stop and help someone in need on the side of the road. At that moment, there's an indeterminacy in your brain that percolates up to the neural networks. You have reasons for doing either of the outcome, and then whatever the result is, he says you're morally responsible for it because there's reasons backing either outcome. But you can't settle which of those outcomes. There's all kinds of philosophical problems, but I'll mention that there's a lot of strange metaphysical commitments in that model. So just to point out very quickly, none of these people claim they've proven we have agent causal event causal free will. Rather, they settle for a much weaker thesis that their views are consistent with our best scientific counts and have not yet been proven false. So there's like a window that maybe these accounts are true. But the mere possibility that we might have this type of free will, I think, is not enough to justify the grounds for doing harm. So consider Kane's account. Not only do agents mental processes have to turn out to be indeterministic, they have to turn out to be indeterministic in a very particular way. So, one, if multiple mutually exclusive aims, like going to my 9 o'clock meeting, stopping to help someone in need, did not cause the brain to go into some kind of chaotic state, the theory would be disproven. If it turned out that the neurological system weren't sensitive to quantum indeterminacies, the theory would be disproven. So you might say maybe there's quantum indeterminacy at the very lowest level of the universe, but not at the level of the brain because the wetware of the brain screens out indeterminacies. If it turned out that neurological systems were sensitive to quantum indeterminacies, but not sensitive enough to amplify them to the level of neural networks, the theory too would be disproven. If it turned out that indeterminacy could in fact exist at the right level, but did not arise at precisely the right temporal moment. So for Kane, it not only has to exist at the right metaphysical level of the brain, it also has to exist at the right moment of choice. And that's the moment after you have reasons for doing either outcome, but the action is not settled. It has to happen in this little window. If it doesn't happen in that window, the theory would be disproven. I would argue that these are not marginal and insubstantial claims, and to justify retributive harm on the grounds that this might all be true, I think amounts to moral malpractice, period. So, compatibilists reject miracles, they reject all the kind of crazy stuff that I've just mentioned, but I would argue that they also lack the justification needed. And this is where Bruce's work is very pertinent. In lieu of justifying the moral responsibility system, most compatibilists just take the system as given and then work within the system. They focus on attitudes, judgments, treatments that are justified within the system. So the best example here is P.F. Strawson's classic paper, where he talks about the reactive attitudes, particularly resentment, indignation, moral blame, things like that. And he talks about them as part of our normal set of attitudes that we employ in interpersonal exchanges and interactions with individuals. Then he says, but there can be this class of actions that we exclude from moral responsibility that these reactive attitudes would not be justified in. And that's cases of profound impairment, brain damage, people with really diminished capacities, maybe children. But other than that, everyone has this kind of moral responsibility that's justified. And for those people that are in this excluded camp, we're justified in taking what he calls the objective attitude. Now, followers of Strawson argue that the denial of all moral responsibility is unacceptable, self-defeating, absurd, impossible, because what you would have to show is that all agents fall in this camp of excluded actions, that where the objective attitude would be justified, that their capacities are impaired, they don't have certain kinds of abilities, they have diminished capacity, lack reasons responsiveness, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say this is just blatantly question begging. The free will skeptic and the moral responsibility skeptic are global skeptics about moral responsibility. So Waller, Peerboom, Neil Levy, Gallenstrassen, myself, we simply don't accept the rules of the system. It's question begging to assume that our ordinary moral responsibility practices are justified without refuting the arguments against global skepticism, against free will skeptics. But they don't even really challenge to do that. So when compatibilists take the normal everyday practices as given and then talk about how the law implements it and how various interpersonal interactions use these kinds of distinctions, they made no effort to justify the ordinary practices. They take them as given and go from there. That's question begging. So I would argue none of these accounts meet the epistemic bar. And so even if you're not a free will skeptic, you should reject retributivism, either because it's impractical, it leads to these counterproductive policies I outlined, it doesn't satisfy the epistemic argument, or you might be just convinced of my free will skepticism. But either way, you should come along and look for an alternative. Okay, so then the next thesis is that I have an alternative. So now my sales pitch, right? Now I'll give you my alternative. Okay. So it begins with Dirk Peerboom's work and the quarantine analogy. So the argument basically runs something like this, and we've already seen premise one. Free will skeptics claim that criminals are not morally responsible for their actions in the basic desert sense. That should be pretty clear by now. Premise two, plainly many carriers of dangerous diseases are not responsible in this or any other sense for contracting their diseases. So let's say I get on a plane to come to Belgium and I contract Ebola and I get off the plane. I've done nothing morally wrong. I don't deserve to suffer. I don't need to be given my just deserts. Retributive punishment is unjustified in this context. But nonetheless, premise three, we generally agree that we are, or at least sometimes, permissible, justified in quarantining this individual. And the grounds for quarantining the individual will be public safety and protection of harm to others. So what we have here is an incapacitation account built on the right of self-defense and protection of harm. So what I'm providing is an alternative, analogous justification for dealing with dangerous criminals. That we could incapacitate serial murderers and very dangerous criminals on an incapacitation account based on the right of self-defense and protection of harm to others, analogous to the same justification that's used in the case of quarantine. But if you accept this model, there's several important constraints that would be placed upon us. First, as less dangerous diseases justify only less preventative measures, less restrictive than quarantine, so less dangerous criminal tendencies justify only more moderate constraints. So by that I mean, we don't quarantine people for the common cold. Right? If I come and I sneeze on you and you get sick, I've caused you some harm. But we accept as a certain amount of risk within society, a certain amount of harm as acceptable. And we don't quarantine people for very low levels like the common cold. We restrict quarantine for a very prescribed, very restricted set of cases. So my model would demand, for example, we would have to look at sentencing reform. We would have to look at the reasons why we incarcerate people. The model would be consistent with, say, the decriminalization of many things that we currently incarcerate people for, like low-level drug possession crimes. It would be consistent with sentencing reform that reduced the length of sentences. Most of the types of cases that we currently incarcerate people for could be better dealt with by other means, I would argue. Drug treatment options, mental health services, monitoring or parole, in many cases could substitute for incarceration. Second, the model demands a degree of concern for the rehabilitation and well-being of criminals. So if you quarantine me after I get off the plane because I have Ebola, the story doesn't end there. You have a moral obligation to treat me for whatever communicable disease I have. So the argument would be that if we incapacitate dangerous criminals, you don't just house them, as I mentioned earlier, in a warehouse in cages and then release them and expect different results. We have to provide certain services, and those might be drug treatment, mental health services, educational work training programs. So the goal of the criminal justice system should be rehabilitation and reintegration. And then thirdly, if a criminal can't be rehabilitated, and there might be some that just simply can't, and our safety requires their indefinite confinement, this account provides no justification for treating that person more cruelly than would be needed to protect public safety. So I would definitely be opposed to solitary confinement, ban the box movement in the United States. That we use solitary confinement, which is inhumane in my view. In the United States, we house people in solitary confinement sometimes for decades. Kalief Browder case in Rikers Island was a classic example. This kid was held 16 years old in solitary confinement for 3 years on the suspicion that he stole the backpack. And he had not actually been found guilty of the crime. He was waiting trial, but he couldn't afford bail. And he was held for 3 years waiting for a court date in solitary confinement. Upon release, they never charged him with a crime. They eventually just dropped the charges. He committed suicide because the damage that had been done by solitary confinement. So now I'm going to place the quarantine model into a much larger framework drawn from public health ethics. And this is my contribution. So I want to move beyond the narrow, I would say myopic focus on punishment. I get it. I'm a free will skeptic. I have to explain to you what do I do with, rapists and serial killers, and I just told you what I do, an incapacitation account based on the right of self-defense. But I think it's too myopic to be focusing only on punishment. And so the public health model works really well here because it's a more broad, systematic approach to public health, but also can be employed in terms of crime. So two major features of public health ethics are relevant for my account, which is prevention and social justice. And the public health model I adopt prioritizes both features, prevention and social justice. So let me go through these real quick. Public health institutions involve a high degree of commitment to the prevention of disease and injury. Think about real life public health institutions. I don't know if you have similar ones, but in the United States, these would include the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the Consumer Protection Agency. The primary function of these institutions is preventative. The CDC's primary mission statement is to prevent a breakout of disease, a pandemic. The EPA's primary function is to prevent contamination of air and water, right? That would affect public health. The Consumer Protection Agency is to protect consumers from defective products and causing injury. Take the CDC. The CDC would only use quarantine after it's already failed in its primary function, right? Quarantine is a stopgap measure because the primary function of these agencies is to prevent the outbreak or disease from occurring in the first place. It's an admittance that they failed in their mission statement when they have to use quarantine. So I would argue that a criminal justice system based on my model would have to take a similar approach to the prevention of crime. Preventing criminal behavior from occurring in the first place is not only more preferable in terms of public safety, it's more consistent with the commitments of free will skeptics. So let me just draw this out for a second. Daniel Dennett is a good example of this. Daniel Dennett has this analogy where he says, I understand the lottery of life is not always fair. We don't have all equal starting points. Some of us have more hurdles than others. We start out economically disadvantaged, a member of a minority, systematically prejudiced or something, sexism, racism, economic inequality. But, and he really uses this analogy, he says, life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And over time, these inequalities equal out. And Bruce Bola calls this the plateau argument, that we all reach a plateau eventually, we become equally morally accountable, Dennett says. I want to say bullshit. That's just wholly crazy, that these natural inequalities often don't equal out over time, they compound themselves over time. So the free will skeptic is deeply affected by the reaction and the awareness that the lottery of life is not always fair. Inequalities set certain hurdles and disadvantages for communities that other communities don't face. And crime is often a byproduct of poverty, homelessness, systemic disadvantage. So instead of punishing criminals and building more supermax prisons, the public health model would advocate addressing systematic causes of crime, such as poverty, inequality. We know that these affect not only bad health outcomes, they also affect crime. We know type 2 diabetes is higher in certain African American communities. We know poor health outcomes are brought about by homelessness or lack of access to public health. These are also many of the same causal determinants of crime. Now, the social justice component is really essential as well. So my account of public health ethics is grounded in a foundation not of utilitarianism, but of social justice. And so public health institutions often look at disparities of life expectancy between poor and rich nations. They look at child mortality rates. They look at how poverty in India affects health outcomes. They look at sexism and how women's rights affects reproductive control and how that affects health outcomes in places like India and around the world. And so public health institutions are essentially social justice institutions because they have to prioritize the injustices that affect negative health outcomes and then have to target those social injustices to try to achieve certain types of better health outcomes. I would argue that a public health approach to criminal behavior likewise maintains that a core moral function of the criminal justice system has to be to identify and remedy social and economic injustice. We can't deal with criminal justice without simultaneously dealing with social justice. That you can't effectively have reform of criminal justice without addressing social inequality, racism, systemic inequality, economic inequality, poverty, systemic disadvantage. Now, I also lately have gone in this direction where I'm trying to develop my social justice account in lines of a capabilities or capacities approach that comes from work by people like Sen and Nussbaum. But there's been a model that's already been developed in public health ethics by Powers and Faden. And so on this account, I'm going to skip because I know I'm running out of time. I've identified 6 essential dimensions of human well-being. So Martha Nussbaum has a list of about 12, and other people have different lists. But my list consists of 6. Health, reasoning, self-determination, attachment, personal security, and respect. And my argument would be that each of these are essential components of human well-being. An agent who lacks one of these lives a sufficiently affected life, deprived life, a form of existence. And so the social justice model would say social justice has to prioritize these 6. And I've gone through and argued that each of these 6 are consistent with freewill skepticism. The 2 that may raise an eyebrow is reasoning and self-determination. But Dirk Piereboom's last book did a great job of showing how reasoning is totally consistent with freewill skepticism. He has a whole chapter on that. And self-determination, I don't mean anything metaphysically similar to free will or basic desert. What I mean is degrees of autonomy, political liberty, lack of repression, lack of inequality due to race, sex, gender, the ability to make one's own choices in a kind of political sense. Attachment, really important, because I think you maintain these even in prison. One of the big problems within the current United States prison system is we take away the attachment to the community of individuals that the person being imprisoned would need to foster well-being. One of the things the Norwegian system does is they have a principle called the principle of normalcy, which I've adopted as my model. And the principle of normalcy, it's official policy in Norway, is that the conditions in prison have to resemble as much as possible the conditions outside of prison. And so the environment of the prison tries to maximize exchange and attachment and relationships within the prison, both among prisoners and prison guards. They also allow people to leave prisons. They allow them to work certain shifts outside of prison and return back at night quite often. And so I would argue that you should maintain all your rights within a incapacitation account. And the only one that we justify limiting is liberty, just like you would in terms of quarantine, actual quarantine. But you don't lose your human dignity when we quarantine individuals for communicable diseases. You don't lose your voting rights. You don't become dehumanized. So we want to maximize these both before and after incapacitation. I know I'm running late, so I'll just wrap it up now and stop. So my final slide. So I would say that we should do away with the pernicious belief in free will, and with it, the belief in basic desert, moral responsibility, just deserts, and especially retributivism. I think it's time to leave these antiquated notions behind, lose our moral anger, and pay attention and shift our focus, our funding, and our attention to the causes that lead to criminality. So the causes that lead to poverty, wealth inequality, educational inequity. And the reorientation should be one of addressing social justice and prevention rather than retributive punishment and payback. Thank you very much.